Today he's going to introduce a friend to talk about a very important subject, particularly 9/11, terrorism, and Al-Qaeda. So would you welcome from the Clinton School, Professor Mark Nichols.
Thank you all very much. Skip, that was too much. You're too kind. I'm not teaching this fall, but I will be teaching again in the spring. And I'd love to have any of you who want to take the course or audit it. It's called American Grand Strategy. We go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic and look at the different strategic choices facing successive American presidents, all the way up to the choices we're facing today. And that brings me to our guest speaker today, Warren Bass, who's very familiar with with this subject and a lot of these questions, which are facing a lot of people in Washington. Warren's a friend of mine. I've known him for several years. He is an historian and an expert on Kennedy and the Middle East. Graduated from Columbia University with his PhD several years ago, and has since worked on the staff of the 9/11 Commission and was a key author of that report. Following that, he went to the Washington Post, had held several different positions, and is now the deputy editor for the Sunday Outlook section, which many of you probably read. Warren is going to talk to us about his experience on the 9/11 Commission, the war on terror, how the Bush administration has fared in that fight against terrorism, and what some of the challenges are in the next facing us in the next 4 years. So with that, let's welcome Warren Bass.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Mark and to Skip Rutherford and all the other people who've helped bring me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should say I grew up in Toronto, so I have always thought that sort of, New Hampshire was the South. It is a pleasure to be down here and see the real thing. I was actually sort of remembering some of my Canadian roots a little earlier, because when the 9/11 Commission was the first and only time that I've worked for the U.S. government. And in order to hold the portfolio that I held, which was investigating things having to do with the National Security Council and the White House, we needed to talk about covert action programs and some cloak and dagger CIA stuff. And in order to do that, you needed a quite high security clearance. And at some point, I find myself at my old job at a think tank up in New York, having an investigator from the Pentagon who was coming to look into pretty much every burp I had ever made over the course of my entire life. And this Pentagon investigator was sort of going down the list, and it says, well, it says here that you were born in Boston, which, as I understand it, is still nominally part of the United States. But it says that you're also a Canadian citizen. And I said, yes, is that going to be a difficulty in getting security clearances? And they said, well, it might be. And I said, you're kidding. This is Canada. This is America's largest trading partner, NATO ally. And the investigator sort of frowned and looked very serious and said, well, you study international politics. You understand how these things can change. He said, let me ask you this. If there was a war between the United States and Canada, whose side would you fight on? And I sort of blinked at them and sort of said, well, I really think everyone got that out of their system in 1812. Which was the wrong answer. And they looked at me very, very seriously. And I'm having a harder time taking this seriously because I am a glasses-wearing, 135-pound historian. I'm not that much use in wartime. And they sort of glowered at me and said, well, you know these things can change. Let me put it to you this way. If the U.S. Air Force started bombing Toronto, would you be upset? To which I replied, yes, yes, I would be upset. And what did my grandmother ever do to Don Rumsfeld? This is a story I think of every April 15th as I sign the check and sort of pass it along. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes to a half hour about some of my service on the commission, some of the things that we learned, some of the things that we saw. I will hope to tempt at least some of the students here into doing some public service of their own, which I guess students in this school need no tempting on. I will also then in the Q&A be glad to take your questions both about the commission, about the war on terrorism, and about anything else in the sort of wider world, which is my unfortunate obsession. And I distinctly remember when I was going through grad school in the 1990s, all of my friends who were working on dot-coms saying, oh, you're crazy, why are you studying the Middle East? What will this ever get you? We're not that interested in the Middle East after all. You should come over and work for us on the dot-com side. Feeling relatively good about that bet. The 9/11 Commission was in many ways an unusual beast. The first thing is that it was an example of bipartisanship in today's Washington that actually worked, that actually got something done, not only in terms of the recommendations that were adopted, but in terms of providing, I think, a credible public narrative explaining what on earth happened to the country, amazingly enough, seven years ago. It feels like it was yesterday in New York City, where I was then living while working on my doctorate in history. There is a temptation in Washington to sort of use commissions when you want to just kick a can down the road, or where there's something that's too difficult, or when you want to just postpone the problem, or where you don't have an answer to a problem but feel as if you should be able to say something that sounds bold and statesmanlike. So you say, let's get a commission. And the fact of the matter is that most commissions, when they come out with their reports, there's a story that goes on page A23 of my paper or the New York Times, and that's pretty much all that they do. The 9/11 Commission was a very different one, and it's a model that's been invoked. Senator McCain recently has been saying that what we need is a 9/11 Commission to look into the financial meltdown. If I or some of my more foreign policy-minded colleagues are ever asked to serve on that, then I advise you to sell all your stocks immediately. But the 9/11 Commission proved different for a few reasons. First of all, it was a commission that sort of kept itself out in the public face. We held public hearings that were designed not only to ask questions of witnesses and to do that in public, in addition to the closed-door interviews that we were doing with people up to the very highest ranks of the U.S. government, up to and including the person for whom this building and this school is named. But it was also to sort of engage the American public in the work that the Commission was doing on their dime, and to try to let the American public have a sense of what we were doing and what we were finding. One of the things that I found, having not worked in government, is that language matters. And the exercise of drafting the final report of the 9/11 Commission, which against, I think to all of our great surprise, went on to become a book that sat on the New York Times bestseller list for 25 weeks, that was made into a mini-series. The first chapter is the basis of the very well done but almost unwatchably intense movie United 93, which talks about the flight that the passengers heroically brought down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the one part of the U.S. air defense network that actually worked on the morning of 9/11 was just ordinary citizens, not NORAD. This story was one that we really wanted to convey to the public, and in a way that people would have some sense of what had happened to the country, what it meant going forward, how it was possible that 19 men with knives had been able to get around all of the defenses of the world's last superpower, and what it meant, and try to lay out some of the challenges for U.S. national security going forward. One thing that was very clear as we were putting that report together was that the nuances of the language mattered enormously. There was, for instance, Lee Hamilton, the former head of the House International Relations Committee, someone who got his start in politics in Indiana by doing what you do to get started on politics in Indiana, which is you play statewide basketball. Lee Hamilton is about 14 feet tall. You would walk out of meetings with him, I'm not 14 feet tall, and you'd say, boss, could you slow down a little? Lee Hamilton had a very strict rule that he didn't want acronyms in the final report. And Lee Hamilton speaks Washington speak. Lee Hamilton is totally capable of referring to Osama bin Laden as UBL, as referring to memorandums of notification as MON, the stream of acronyms, and he wouldn't let us use them. NATO was fine, CIA was fine, but if you wanted to go and use an acronym, you had to go to this incredibly powerful former congressman who could have been a Secretary of State, who was on President Clinton's short list for Vice President, and say, Congressman, can we use that acronym? This is the sort of concern that Lee Hamilton and Tom Kean, his Republican co-chair, had for making sure that this report was open and clear and easy to understand for the American public. It struck me, there's an old line which is that, I think it might have been Mario Cuomo who used it, said that politicians campaign in poetry and they govern in prose. And the experience of working on the commission brought home to me the seriousness of the latter part of that. I'm not quite sure what we campaign in these days. It may be limericks rather than poetry. But we absolutely govern in very direct prose, and the meanings and nuances of language matter enormously. And we would find ourselves, while drafting the commission report, which was written by committee, there were about 20 staffers, myself included, who had a hand in drafting sections of it. And we had to get it through something that the whole staff, which was also bipartisan, they're not hired for partisan affiliation, we were hired for expertise. But we had to get it, there were Republicans and strong Republicans and Dems and strong Dems, and you had to get it past everyone before it could go up to the 10 commissioners who also had very strong opinions. And as we were editing it, we would project the thing up on the wall of our crummy little conference room at an undisclosed location in downtown Washington. And you would sit there with all of the people who knew various parts of the chapter that you were working on, and you would go, there would be the State Department, the staffer was looking at the State Department record and the CIA record and the FBI record, and myself who did the National Security Council. You would go over it, and you would go over it line by excruciating line, and project it up there, and you would go until 3, 4 in the morning. And people's tempers got frayed, people got irritated, people got cranky, people would occasionally put their heads down on the table and take a 5-minute snooze. There is a sort of perception that the 9/11 Commission, because the report was so successful, became a sort of gold standard of a process to imitate. And the fact of the matter is that there were things about the process that were, I think, not things that I would care to repeat. We were really tired, we were working really hard, and we were under a tremendous time pressure. We had 18 months to get the whole thing done. We were able to get an extension from the Congress, which was not crazy about giving us a few more months, and having the thing come out at the end of July 2004, coincidentally enough on my birthday, coming out in the heat of the 2004 presidential campaign. But this view of the commission from outside as having been this seamlessly run process, I would temper it simply by saying the thing that made it work so well was that the commissioners and the staff were there to try to honor the victims, to try to memorialize them, and to try to give some comfort to their loved ones and some guidance to the nation as a whole about what had happened and the challenges we faced going forward. That was what kept you up and running at 4 in the morning. It was not that we had organized a bureaucracy so brilliantly, it was that everyone was determined to get the job done, and there was an old line, sort of good enough for government work. Only the very, very best was good enough for this particular bit of government work, and there was nobody who was prepared to give anything less than 100%. Let me briefly talk to you about some of the things that we found. My portfolio was the National Security Council, which is a strange and poorly understood body within the White House staff. The U.S. system of making national security decisions is an interagency one, where there are a bunch of different players who come to the table. The State Department does diplomacy, the FBI does law enforcement, including the forensic investigations of terrorist attacks occurring overseas. The CIA does covert action and intelligence. There are other intelligence community agencies that get involved in the intel side of it. The Treasury Department deals with the financial aspects, including sanctions, and the Defense Department does the military. So you have all of these players who have to be at the table, and it's the job of the National Security Council to make sure that all the pistons are firing right. To make sure that decisions get made, to make sure that decisions get staffed out properly, and that when the principals and their deputies, the cabinet rank officers are known as the principals, and the deputies come underneath them, making sure that these decisions are teed up properly or vetted properly, and make sure that when the decisions are made, that they get implemented out by the different agencies, that, you know, so-and-so has to impose sanctions, so-and-so has to start staging a covert operation abroad, make sure that all of that happens as best as is humanly possible. This is also the view from the core of the core of the core. These are the people who are bringing it all together, who are seeing all of the different paper that's out in all of the different agencies, and are able to have a big picture perspective that you sometimes don't get if you're just sitting somewhere in the bowels of the State Department. And the story that basically we see is one of the U.S. government coming slowly and painfully to terms with a new and different type of threat, a transnational, ideologically based Islamist terrorist network led by a guy named Osama bin Laden, an uncommonly gifted Saudi dissident who is very keen to topple the Saudi monarchy, and who proves to be a minor organizational genius. He's capable of erecting this far-flung network that has a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of bloodthirstiness, and an ability to sort of dream big, plan big, and strike big. This is someone who initially the U.S. government thinks is just a terrorist financier. And it takes several years over the course of the middle part of the Clinton administration to get a handle on who this guy is and what he's up to. And there's this discovery, among other things, that bin Laden comes from this quite distinguished Saudi family, and he has all of these siblings, written about magnificently in a book by my former boss, Steve Coll, who has a book out called The Bin Ladens, which is a terrific read. But there's this one moment where Anthony Lake, who is the national security advisor in Bill Clinton's first term, sort of is being briefed on bin Laden and says, "Ah, yes, the old 38th child syndrome." The U.S. government's understanding of the lethality of al-Qaeda changes dramatically on the morning of August 7th, 1998, and about 5:30 in the morning, the National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, calls President Clinton and wakes him up with the news that the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania have been destroyed by simultaneous suicide bombs. The simultaneous attacks are often regarded by terrorist groups as the hallmark of a truly sophisticated attack. It takes real tradecraft to pull that off, and the fact that al-Qaeda was able to penetrate the defenses of 2 embassies in 2 different countries and set off these suicide bombs within minutes of each other before other embassies around the world can see that American embassies are under attack and harden their defenses is a real triumph of terrorist tradecraft. And it suggests that there is a new and more ambitious and more dangerous type of terrorist network that is out there. Older style terrorists like Carlos the Jackal from the 1970s never dreamed of bringing down an entire building. This is a truly deadly attack. Most of the people who are killed in these attacks are Foreign Service nationals, which is to say Kenyans and Tanzanians who are working for the State Department in various capacities inside these embassies. And I think to some degree the American public reaction is muted because only about a dozen American citizens are killed in the attacks, even though several hundred African nationals are killed in the attacks. And this, I think, changes the reaction. President Clinton decides to strike back for only the 3rd time in U.S. history. The U.S. government uses military force in response to a terrorist attack. The previous occasions were President Reagan bombing Libya in the late 1980s, and President Clinton, when he first comes into office, bombing Iraq over the attempted assassination of former President George Herbert Walker Bush, the father of the current president. This is the third time that the U.S. government has used military force against terrorism, and it's the only time to date that the U.S. government has used it against a transnational terrorist network rather than a state that is sponsoring nasty terrorist activities like Libya or Iraq. So this is a real watershed. We then traced that story out, mindful as always that the federal government is often a reactive beast, and that it's when something huge happens to put itself onto the federal government's agenda that it really bears down on it. We discovered that the Clinton administration had thought of a series of follow-on strikes on bin Laden training camps in Afghanistan. The original strikes on August 20th, 98, in response to the embassy bombings, are referred to as Operation Infinite Reach. The follow-on strikes were codenamed Operation Infinite Resolve. Perhaps ironically, these strikes, codenamed Operation Infinite Resolve, never actually happened, which may tell you something about the depth of resolve. This was pretty much the end of the military story before 9/11. There was no serious contemplation of actually invading Afghanistan to try to root out these terrorist training camps that were just churning out bad guys in the service of al-Qaeda. And to some degree, the reason there was no real consideration of that was because the American public probably would not have stood for it. The American public was not yet alive to the full extent and deadliness of al-Qaeda, and the idea of going to war in Afghanistan in the middle of nowhere probably would have just seemed like far too high a reach, and it's never seriously discussed by either the Clinton administration or the Bush administration before 9/11. The Clinton administration does try a few other things. It tries using Navy submarines offshore to see if they get actionable intelligence about where bin Laden's whereabouts might be, whether they could fire cruise missiles and manage to hit him while he was in that same location, which had a bunch of technical problems, both about how you find out where bin Laden is at any given point in time and how you make sure that he's going to still be there after the elapsed window of time that it would take to actually rev up the gyroscopes on these cruise missiles, get them in on their target, and make sure that you don't just wind up blowing up a house that bin Laden was at 5 hours ago and has long since left, and all you wind up killing are civilians. The Clinton administration tried a variety of covert action vehicles. The most interesting and James Bond-like is a device called the Predator, which is still being used in various U.S. military operations today. This is a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, a sort of pilotless plane that flies in low over Afghanistan, in which the Clinton administration thinks actually spotted bin Laden on its maiden flight over Afghanistan over a bin Laden base called Tarnak Farms in southern Afghanistan, which was the root of where the Taliban were based in the south of Afghanistan. They spotted a man in a highly tall man, you can sort of measure by the shadow, a highly tall man in white robes. And who people seem to be sort of flocking around, and the Clinton people decided that that was almost certainly bin Laden, and started looking towards the idea of maybe you could put missiles on these Predator drones so that instead of just being able to spot bin Laden, they could actually fire at him and take him out sort of video game style in real time, which was an idea that is utilized after 9/11 with some real success and kills, we think, the number 3 leader, a guy named Mohammed Atef, who was a quite senior al-Qaeda military commander working in Afghanistan side by side with bin Laden. The Clinton people talk about a somewhat happier story, which is the Millennium Crisis in December '99, when there is this flurry of warnings that American targets overseas may be struck, that the Jordanian intelligence service disrupts a plan to attack American and Israeli tourists at various hotels frequented by Westerners in Jordan. The U.S. government goes on high alert. Some of the difficulties of getting these various parts of the creaky national security machinery to play well with each other fall down because they're kicked so vigorously by various cabinet rank and sub-cabinet rank officials. Richard Clark, who is the Clinton administration and the pre-9/11 Bush administration's counterterrorism coordinator on the White House staff, he warns about whether there's a possibility that al-Qaeda might target aircraft The whole thing gets goosed to an even higher level when an alert customs agent on the border between Canada, my home and native land, and Washington State finds that the last guy off of the ferry coming into the United States seems to be acting sort of fidgety. Perhaps he has drugs. Perhaps he's got something in his trunk. This customs agent stops this guy, who turns out to be an Algerian-born jihadist named Ahmed Rassam, and discovers that what he has in his trunk is actually a bunch of explosives and a map of LAX airport. At which point this whole effort goes into overdrive, and the U.S. government finds itself thinking about attacks not just at U.S. facilities overseas, but about attacks in the U.S. homeland. This sort of brings us towards the end of the Clinton administration, and they are replaced in January 2001 by George W. Bush and a new national security team. The NSC is now led by National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. Richard Clarke carries over into this period, and Richard Clarke comes to feel that he is not being listened to. He refers to some of the Bush team as having been preserved in amber from the last time that they served in government, when the Soviet Union was being dismantled and was still around, and comes to be quite frustrated with them. They, in turn, are, I think, a little skeptical about Clarke, who has a reputation for some sharp elbows, is a very skilled federal bureaucrat, but someone who's a real bulldozer. And they're never quite sure. He's also a Clinton holdover, and they're not entirely sure how they feel about that. And when the Bush administration is confronted with the issue of al-Qaeda, they decide, we want to review this. Clarke comes into office and has a memo on Condoleezza Rice's desk on January 25th, 2001, just days after the president is sworn in, saying, we urgently need a principals committee on the al-Qaeda threat. And urgently in the memo, which I saw, and which I hope the American public will get to see when all of this stuff is declassified, including a number of very interesting documents sitting in that building right over there, the guts of which you can get from the 9/11 report, but which it would be great if they could get out and let the public see the public's papers. The word urgently in this request for a meeting on al-Qaeda is underlined, and it's in bold. That meeting doesn't happen until September 4th, 2001. And in the meantime, the Bush administration is engaged on something which is actually quite sensible, which is a review of a difficult national security policy. And these sorts of reviews are, if you read my post-colleague Bob Woodward's new book, The War Within, which is about the decisions that lead to the surge of U.S. troops into Iraq, what you see is actually the National Security Council doing much the same sort of thing that was done in 2001. They look at a problem, they turn it over, they get a bunch of different inputs in, and they came to what in the case of the surge was a quite different policy from what the Bush administration's Iraq policy had been up till that point. And I think most people in the room would agree that that actually worked quite well in that instance, and that Iraq is, the security situation is much better there. That same trick didn't work quite as well with al-Qaeda, just because the clock was ticking, unbeknownst to the Bush administration officials, but with hints to the Bush administration officials. There are a drumbeat of threats that come in over the summer of 2001 that al-Qaeda is planning something that is massive, that is spectacular, and that is of deep, deep concern to a bunch of people, including Richard Clarke, the White House counterterrorism coordinator, and George Tenet, the director of Central Intelligence, who says that he is running around with his hair on fire, trying to get people's attention. On probably the strangest experience that I personally had while on the staff of the commission was coming across a memo that Richard Clarke, the counterterrorism coordinator, wrote for his boss, Condi Rice, on September 4th, 2001, to sort of get her into the right frame of mind for the meeting of the principals committee that was going to be held that day. And that memo I'll just sort of read from, and just imagine yourself sort of sitting in a secure White House facility, which is where we were reading through all of these highly classified and closely held NSC documents, and it was just a few people on the staff, myself included, who were able to read these things. And there's this note sitting in the stack on September 4th, and you know what's coming at this stage, even though the principals don't, and Condi Rice doesn't, and even Dick Clark doesn't, and you're reading this memo, and it reads as follows. It says, "The real question for the principals, for these cabinet rank officials, was whether they were, quote, serious about dealing with the al-Qaeda threat. Is al-Qaeda a big deal? And then underlined, Clark makes a reference to, he runs an interagency committee, a working level committee that's called the Counterterrorism Security Group, or the CSG. And in underlined, Clark writes, decision makers should imagine themselves in a future day when the CSG has not succeeded in stopping al-Qaeda attacks and hundreds of Americans lay dead in several countries, including the U.S. What would those decision makers wish they had done earlier? That future day could happen at any time. September 4th, 2001. This is, and I'll sort of wind down here, this is, I think, some of the lasting value of the 9/11 Commission. Nobody knew about that memo until we got to it. Condoleezza Rice knew, Dick Clark knew, the American public didn't know. The American public did not know that there was a CIA briefing, a presidential daily briefing to President Bush on August 6th, the headline of which was, bin Laden determined to strike inside the U.S. The American public also did not know the full story behind the failure of the Clinton administration to retaliate in Afghanistan for the bombing of the USS Cole in October 2000. There were a series of things, and I think I have a long list of things that both administrations, I think, could have done better, and I suspect that many people in both of those administrations would feel the same way. There is a long list of things that the American public simply did not know and that the Commission was able to bring out and put out into the public record. And I will wind down before turning it over to your questions, which don't just have to be about the Commission. I'm glad to talk about anything sort of on the world scene that's on your minds. But something I think particularly in this school that I think is of interest is to use the story that's unearthed in the 9/11 report as a way of trying not to make the same mistakes next time. There is a wonderful old line from Henry Kissinger in which he says, "We will not make the same old mistakes, we will make entirely new ones." That is, as Skip and Mark Nichols and others in the room who've served in senior positions, both in the politics or the national security side, understand that is the nature of the beast. That is how the U.S. government works. And I don't think that we can reasonably, we want people to avoid as many future pitfalls as they can. I think the one thing we can insist on is that people pay attention to the past mistakes and try to make sure that they set up structures and processes and procedures and ways of turning around at complicated questions in their head that will let them skirt past the same old pitfalls. I think you will find, particularly for the students in the room, I think you will find the 9/11 report an unusually detailed case study in the making of U.S. national security policy, in decisions that were made that were quite far-sighted, in decisions that were missed that were quite near-sighted. It's a fascinating story. I hope it's one that teaches lessons. If it does, then I will certainly feel as if my service was more than worthwhile. Thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
Welcome to Little Rock.
Thank you.
I'm Annie Abrams, and I am a little sister, but a big sister to Herbert Denton, who was the city editor for the Washington Post.
Oh, fantastic.
And he also was a roommate to Don, so I got to know the Grahams pretty good when he was a city editor, and of course he passed in Canada as a bureau chief. So I've always had an international interest. On last night and the night before, I listened to our former Secretary of State. I was very interested in their perspective of where we are now and where we can be in the future. As a result of that, I've been thinking a lot about my own experiences. And I'd like for you, as a historian, because I'm one not by certification but by experience, that I'd like for you to think in terms of how will history deal with the history of Alaska and Hawaii in today's role in which they're playing, But to look back at the history of Alaska, how did it come to be the 49th? And how did Hawaii come to be the 50th? And how I hope I live to be when Washington, D.C. is the 51st. What is the context of these three areas in our country's history constitutionally? And who was president when both of those two states became the 49th and the 50th?
Thank you. I'm delighted to hear about your association with the Graham family. I have certainly enjoyed being involved with them. I will duck a bit of the question simply because my history degree is mostly based on the history of U.S. foreign policy, so I know much less about Alaska and Hawaii than I probably should. I will say that there is something I think historically extraordinary that in this race we have national candidates on both tickets who are from Hawaii and Alaska, and or have roots there. Senator Obama obviously represents Illinois, but I think it's a tough election for the lower 48. Also interesting that Senator McCain has extensive ties overseas with a very distinguished Navy family that spent a lot of time growing abroad when he was growing up. I think it's fascinating. I will add only as a dual American-Canadian citizen that I am mildly hurt that even though Governor Palin has said that she has national security expertise because she's so close to Russia, that she hasn't mentioned her great expertise on Canada as well. On behalf of my countrymen, I am miffed.
Bob.
My name is Rod Cottrell. I'm a retired geophysicist and also an obsolete one. My question is...
I work for an obsolete industry too, don't worry.
What are we going to do about Iran?
That is the question. That is as succinct a question as you will ever get at a talk, and I wish I had a good succinct answer. It is an extraordinarily difficult problem, and one in which we don't have a lot of particularly good options. The Iranian government has been I don't think this is at all what the Bush team intended, but their strategic position has improved dramatically as a result of the toppling of Saddam Hussein, who was the nemesis of the Iranian government, who launched a war in 1980 that lasted for 8 years, led to 1 million people killed, something that was deeply traumatic to both Iraqi and Iranian society. And I think that the Iranians were delighted to see Saddam go and to be replaced by a democratically elected, Shia-dominated government that has been relatively cordial towards its Iranian neighbors. From the view from Tehran is that's a tremendous win. There was another regional government which the Iranians got along very poorly with, and in the late 90s there were brief flurries that there might even be military action between the two. And this was the Taliban when they were running Afghanistan. So the fall of these two viciously anti-American governments has also happened to get rid of two governments who were very low on the Iranian government's list of its favorite leaders. So they have actually an interesting game to play in Iraq, simply because things are actually, in the broad schemes, have been, Iran has had its strategic environment improved somewhat by the war in Iraq. The question of whether the Iranians actually need to go ahead and get nukes is a tough one. The historical record, sort of ironically, is clear, is that the Bush administration wound up invading the one member of the axis of evil that seems not to have had an active nuclear program. North Korea, the CIA is pretty sure already has a series of nukes, and Iran is obviously a question. I think everyone sort of takes CIA estimates with a grain of salt when we are told that a Middle Eastern country has an active nuclear program after the agency managed to get so many things wrong about the Iraq story, which is not to absolve policymakers of some of the statements that they were making about Iraq's capacities. And there's a fascinating book by a colleague of mine, Bart Gellman, who's an amazing investigative reporter who's written a fascinating book that I'm going to be hopefully finishing on the flight back up this afternoon, called Angler, which is about Vice President Cheney, which I warmly recommend to you. It's a terrific, terrific work, and has a series of things about the Vice President's role in all of this, which I think are fascinating. If the Iranians really want to get the bomb, it's very hard to dissuade a regime from getting nukes that really wants to have nukes. And the things that we can use to dissuade them are not that effective. There are sanctions, which work best when the whole world is in on them, because if it's only one country that's trying to block off trade, well, there's all sorts of ways around that and all sorts of alternative ways of getting goods. You have oil prices are so high, the Iranian regime its balance sheets, I think this week in particular, probably look somewhat better than ours do. So it's difficult to do much on the financial side. Covert action, is always tough for any of us sitting in this room to have a sense of what the U.S. military is able to do. And if the United States were to launch military strikes, there would be the question of how Iran would respond. What would it do to oil facilities? What would it do to Shia militias inside Iraq that are friendly to Iran, have been quieter with us recently, but could be turned back on and could be attacking American soldiers again? What would Iran's proxy group Hezbollah, a Shiite-dominated militia in southern Lebanon, what havoc would it unleash in Israel? Does Hezbollah, which has been involved in terrorist attacks in the past, does it have the capacity to strike in Europe, in Latin America, where there are thought to perhaps be Hezbollah cells? Perhaps there's even some way that they can slip bad guys into the United States. You can really be off to the races quite quickly if the United States does bomb Iranian nuclear facilities. You could also have a difficulty if the Israelis go ahead and decide that they're not willing to sort of take the risks, even if the Americans are. And you can, all of these have a lot of potential for escalation, and the next president, whether it's Senator Obama or Senator McCain, I think will be spending an extraordinary amount of their time trying to puzzle this one out. I wish I could say that there was a good answer, but there's no obvious one. You could try to offer the Iranians a sort of grand bargain that we will give you a series of carrots and sticks, to some degree mostly economic and diplomatic, if you will knock off the nuclear program. But that only works if the Iranians are not hell-bent on getting the bomb. If they have really decided that it's in their national security interest to have it, if they've sort of noticed, gee, the United States invaded Iraq and got rid of Saddam, but they haven't invaded North Korea and gotten rid of Kim Jong-il, and the difference is that Kim has nukes and Saddam didn't, well, maybe the rational conclusion to draw from that is that if you have nukes, you can deter the United States and you don't get invaded. And it would be a nasty but not totally irrational calculation on Iran's part to have them as an insurance policy to boost their regional power. Very nasty problem. Hard to imagine living with a nuclear Iran, but hard to imagine exactly how you stop it if the regime in Tehran is really, really determined to get the stuff. It's a real poser.
Nicholas Hall, Clinton School student. My question is regards to terrorism and Osama bin Laden. Do you think the Bush administration will release any new information on Osama bin Laden or terrorist attacks in an effort to sway the national elections in November?
I will partially do the politician's answer of dodging a hypothetical. I do think that there are some people in the Kerry campaign, just to sort of flip the question a little bit, there are people in the Kerry campaign who noticed that bin Laden has this habit of occasionally releasing tapes and messages close to American elections, and who are convinced that if bin Laden himself would not have released a tape right before the 2004 vote, that Kerry would have won Ohio and won the presidency. I think it's a mistake to assume that that the bad guys don't occasionally look at how the U.S. political system works, that they didn't notice that what are known as the 3/11 bombings, which were a series of bombs that were placed on Spanish commuter trains outside Madrid, and went off days before a Spanish election, which was being contested between a more left-wing candidate who wanted to get out of Iraq and a more conservative candidate, Aznar, who was someone who was quite close to President Bush and his Iraq policy. It swung the election, and the Aznar lost and the socialists came in, and that was a real change in Spain's policy. I think the bad guys notice these sorts of things. I think these things are not coincidences. I think the bad guys noticed that in 1995, when the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas set off a series of suicide bombers on Israeli commuter buses, just the regular city buses going around town in Jerusalem, that it swung the Israeli election, and Benjamin Netanyahu was elected, defeating the incumbent Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who was a great proponent of the Oslo peace process. So I think the bad guys notice these sorts of things and can be fairly sophisticated about it. At the same time, I would also caution against too much cynicism about whether the Bush administration or any administration will just sort of play games with that sort of stuff just for electoral advantage. If it does, I think the public will howl. I certainly think lots of people in the press will howl. But I do think that those national security decisions are not just made out of the political office of the White House, which isn't involved in this sort of stuff. They are made by a large national security bureaucracy, and I think there are people who are dedicated career professionals there who would really hate to see their work turned into a political football in that sort of a venal and calculating way. And I think there would probably be some internal pushback as well. And I will know much more by mid-November.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Stephanie Bailey. Would you comment on the Soviet Union and the Georgia situation and why Condoleezza Rice thinks it's in our interest to threaten them at this time?
Thank God it is no longer the Soviet Union. It is merely Russia, which is not as tractable as it used to be. I was actually talking about this with Skip Rutherford earlier. The Georgia situation seems to me a fairly nasty one and a fairly difficult one. It is not always, if you're going to live next door to a superpower, you want to pick that superpower very carefully. If you happen to choose badly and be living next door to a nasty one, it often makes life pretty unpleasant. I think that you had in President Saakashvili, you had an interesting, dynamic, young pro-Western leader. I think Saakashvili is about my age, which is frightening, particularly if you're Georgian. You had, he made some moves that were, which turn out to have had disastrous consequences. It takes nothing away from the thuggish nature of Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia in this episode to recognize that there were Georgian actions that sort of at least gave Putin an excuse to move, which doesn't condone what Putin did. It just sort of contextualizes it a little. And it is just difficult in the broad sweep of history to live next door to an angry great power that when you want to do something that great power doesn't want you to do. I think as a historian I should say that the United States has certainly treated countries in its backyard with some degree of, at least at a minimum, high-handedness. And certainly if you were to look back to cases like the 1956 Hungarian uprising, led by Imre Nagy, which is crushed by Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Budapest. At the height of the 1956 American presidential campaign, Dwight Eisenhower is furious. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, is furious. They have promised, they were elected in '52 with a promise to roll back the influence of Soviet communism, and here the Soviets are rolling their tanks into downtown Budapest and killing civilians in large numbers, and there's nothing that the U.S. can do about it. And there's nothing that the U.S. could do about it. You can bluster, you can talk, you can think about sanctions, but militarily, there was just no way, we were no more coming to pull the Georgians' fat out of the fire in 2008 than Ike and Dulles were coming to pull the Hungarians' fat out of the fire in 1956. And that, I think, is just a hard geopolitical fact of life. There may be things that can be done over the long term to try to mellow Russian behavior, and the predominant paradigm, which is led, I think, by Clinton administration officials such as Strobe Talbott, who is the Deputy Secretary of State in the second term, is to try to engage Russia and weave it in a part of a Europe that is whole and free, to use the Clinton administration term. That is a policy for which there was significant bipartisan support, and the idea of weaving Russia into the architecture of Europe is one that was very much high in the thinking of Bush national security officials, including Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who is a Sovietologist and is is an expert on Moscow's behavior. The fact, I think, that gamble may not have worked, the fact potentially that the decision to expand NATO up to the borders of what's now Russia, that may have actually changed Russian politics in a way that we're not happy with, which George Kennan, the architect of the U.S. containment doctrine, warned it would. All of those questions, I think, are very much up for grabs, and if the main answer of engaging Russia and weaving it into the European system does not work, then it's an open question of what actually does and what will produce a Russia that behaves in a way that is more to our liking. That is a real question, and when you have sort of been trying with some consistency one long-term policy and discover that it doesn't seem to be working, I think you have a real question. I will add one last thing, which is a sort of grim note, but one that I think is sort of lost in much of our discussions of the Russian situation. I would argue, along with Tom Kean, the chairman of the commission, and Lee Hamilton, the co-chair, that the most important item on the agenda that we have with Russia is tying down each and every nuclear weapon in that country that is guarded under security regimens that we would not regard as adequate to protect American nuclear weapons. There have been a series of scary reports in the press about the way the Russians control not just their strategic arsenal, which are the long-term sort of city-killing nukes, but their tactical arsenal, which is these shorter-range battlefield nukes. The types that were actually on Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, making sure that those things are all completely secure and in a place where no al-Qaeda affiliate or goon or oligarch or international thug of any type could ever get their hands on them, because if such a weapon does detonate in an American city, it will change American foreign policy in a way that will absolutely dwarf 9/11. This is an absolute game changer. This is something that was agreed upon by both President Bush and Senator Kerry in the 2004 presidential debates. They both agreed that this was the paramount threat to U.S. national security. If it is, in fact, the paramount threat, I would love to see the country behaving as if that is the #1 item on our agenda. It is a technical problem. It is something that should be soluble. There are some things, why do people join al-Qaeda? That is a big, scary metaphysical question that is hard to answer. There are bureaucrats who know how to tie down and secure nuclear weapons. That's one that should be within the lift of the U.S. government. I truly hope that that's one that we'll get right over the next, I don't think we have 4 years necessarily to do it. I think we should get that done really, really fast. Let me urge you all to if you haven't, pick up a copy of the Commission report. It is a good read. There are chapters of it that are quite Tom Clancy-like. I hope that you'll have a look at it. I hope it'll be of particular interest to the students, and I'm really grateful for your time and attention. Thank you so much for having me.
Warren, thank you very much.